What do the ruins of a lost city really tell us? If you walk the windswept coast of northern Tunisia today, you'll find scattered stones, columns half buried by time, and a faint outline of harbors that once buzzed with life. This is all that remains of Carthage, a city that, at its peak, stood as the most powerful rival to Rome and the heart of a civilization that shaped the Mediterranean world. Everyone has heard of Rome with its emperors and legions, its roads and monuments. But Carthage? For many, the name is just a shadow, a footnote in Roman triumph. And yet, behind that name lies a story of ambition, innovation, prosperity, and ultimately, destruction on a scale rarely seen in ancient history. Why did this city become the target of such utter annihilation? What made Rome see Carthage, not as a neighbor or a rival, but as an enemy that had to be erased from the face of the earth? The story of Carthage is not just a tale of battles and sieges, though there are plenty of those. It is also the story of a people who built their lives around the sea, who traded with distant lands, who worshiped gods both familiar and strange, and who, for centuries, stood at the crossroads of Africa and Europe. Today, when we look at the scattered blocks and weathered mosaics, it's hard to imagine the energy and noise that once filled these streets. Carthage was a city of merchants and sailors, priests and craftsmen, slaves and aristocrats. Its harbors were among the wonders of the ancient world, capable of sheltering hundreds of ships. Its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the Mediterranean, silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, gold from Africa, and glass from the East. Its people spoke Punic, a language descended from the Phoenicians. But their city was a melting pot, home to Libyans, Greeks, Numidians, and others drawn by opportunity or conquest. But the ruins tell another story too, a story of violence and loss. In 146 BC, after 3 long wars and decades of suspicion and hatred, the Romans stormed Carthage. The city burned for days. Tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. The city's walls were leveled, its harbors filled with rubble. The Romans wanted no trace of Carthage to remain. There is a legend that they salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether or not this detail is true, it captures the spirit of what happened. Carthage was not just defeated, it was deliberately erased. So, why does Carthage still matter? The story of Carthage is not only about loss, it is also about resilience and creativity, about the connections between people and places, and about the dangers of rivalry and fear. In many ways, the struggle between Rome and Carthage set the stage for the world that followed. It was a contest of ideas, as much as armies, republic against republic, commerce against conquest, tradition against change. If we want to understand the rise and fall of Carthage, we have to go back to the beginning, to the world of the Phoenicians, to the founding of a city on the edge of empire, and to the dreams and fears that shaped an entire civilization. What does it take for a city to rise from nothing and become a power that shapes history? To answer this for Carthage, we must look far across the Mediterranean to the ancient lands of Canaan, where cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus were already old by the time Carthage was founded. These were the Phoenicians, a people famous for their skill with ships and their talent for trade. Living along a narrow strip of coast, squeezed between mountains and the sea, the Phoenicians learned early that their fortune would depend not on conquering land, But on mastering the waves, the Phoenicians became sailors, explorers, and merchants. Their ships, built from sturdy cedar wood, carried not just goods, but ideas across the Mediterranean. They traded purple dye, glass, timber, and precious metals. Their alphabet, a simple and adaptable system for writing, spread wherever they went, and became the ancestor of many modern scripts. But for all their success, the Phoenician homeland was never truly secure. Powerful empires like Egypt and Assyria eyed their cities with envy. And as threats grew, some Phoenicians looked west, seeking new places to settle and new routes to control. It was in this context, around the end of the 9th century BC, that a group of Phoenician settlers arrived on the North African coast. The land was rich, and the sea offered a natural harbor, protected from storms and easy to defend. According to legend, a woman named Elissa or Dido led her people to this place after fleeing her brother, the king of Tyre. The story goes that when the local Berber ruler said she could have as much land as she could cover with an ox hide, Dido cleverly cut the hide into thin strips and encircled a large area on the hill known as the Byrsa. It is a tale of wit and determination, and whether or not it happened exactly as told, it captures the spirit of those first Carthaginians, practical, resourceful, and unafraid of challenges. From these beginnings, Carthage grew quickly. The site was nearly perfect for a trading city. To the north and east stretched the open Mediterranean linking Carthage to Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. To the south and west lay the fertile plains of North Africa, home to Berber tribes and rich with grain, olives, and fruit. The harbor, deep and well protected, made it easy for ships to come and go, and the nearby salt pans brought wealth from one of the most basic but valuable commodities of the ancient world. The early city, like other Phoenician colonies, was built around the Byrsa hill. Houses were packed closely together, with narrow streets winding between them. At the summit stood temples to the Carthaginian gods, especially Baal-Hamon and Tanit, who would remain at the center of Carthaginian religion for centuries. This city's first walls were modest, but as Carthage grew richer and more important, they became more formidable. Carthage was never an isolated outpost. From the beginning, its people mixed with the local Berbers, learned from them, and sometimes fought with them. The city's language, Punic, was a branch of Phoenician, but it absorbed words and customs from its neighbors. The Carthaginians adopted elements of Berber dress and even their gods, creating a unique blend that set them apart from their cousins in the east. Trade always stood at the heart of Carthaginian life. The city's merchants reached across the sea, building a network of colonies and trading posts that stretched from Cyprus and Malta to southern Spain and Morocco. Carthage became the center of this web, the place where goods from Africa, Europe, and the Near East were gathered, stored, and shipped onwards. Silver from the mines of Iberia, tin from the distant British Isles, ivory and gold from Africa, wheat from Sicily, all these passed through Carthage's markets. The city grew wealthy, and its people built large houses adorned with mosaics and wall paintings and filled with imported luxuries. But Carthage was more than a marketplace. The city's leaders realized early that to remain powerful, they needed to control not just trade routes, but also the sea itself. The Carthaginian navy became one of the largest and most advanced in the world. Their shipyards could produce dozens of warships each year, and their sailors were trained from a young age. The city's harbors were marvels of engineering, one for commerce, filled with merchant vessels, and another for war, circular in shape and lined with docks for hundreds of ships. At the center of the military harbor stood an island reserved for the admiral's headquarters. This design allowed Carthage to protect both its trade and its independence. The growing power of Carthage did not go unnoticed. Other Phoenician cities, threatened by rival empires in the east, began to rely on Carthage for protection and support. Carthaginian influence spread across North Africa, and the city became the leader of a loose confederation of colonies and allies. This brought new challenges. The Greeks, expanding westward from their own crowded homeland, began to settle in Sicily and southern Italy. They competed fiercely with the Carthaginians for control of trade and territory, and their cities sometimes allied with local rivals against Carthage. Inside Carthage, society was organized around a mix of family, wealth, and tradition. The city was ruled by a council of elders, members of the most powerful families, who elected 2 chief magistrates each year, known as Sophites. These were not kings in the traditional sense, but rather judges or leaders who served a fixed term. Power was balanced by popular assemblies, where all free male citizens could, in theory, have a voice. In practice, the wealthy merchant class dominated politics and decision-making, but the system helped prevent tyranny and allowed for debate. Religion played a central role in Carthaginian life. The people honored a range of gods and goddesses, but above all stood Baal Hamon, often depicted as an old man with ram's horns, and Tanit, a mother goddess who symbolized fertility and protection. Temples to these deities dominated the skyline, and rituals were held throughout the year to ensure good harvests, victory in war, and the well-being of the city. One of the most controversial aspects of Carthaginian religion was the practice of sacrifice, including, according to some ancient sources, the offering of children during times of crisis. Archaeological evidence from the Tophet, a sacred cemetery, shows that young children were sometimes buried with offerings to the gods. Whether this was a common practice or exaggerated by Carthage's enemies remains debated, but it has cast a long shadow over the city's reputation. Carthage was a city of contrasts. It was cosmopolitan, yet deeply rooted in its traditions. It was rich, but always alert to threats. It was both a successor to Phoenician culture and a creator of something new on African soil. By the 6th century BC, Carthage had become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Its influence reached from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the shores of Libya, from southern Spain to the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. But with power came new responsibilities and dangers. Carthage now had to defend its interests against old and new rivals, manage its relationships with local peoples, and balance the demands of its growing population. The city's leaders invested in walls, ships, and alliances. They sent out explorers like Hanno, who sailed down the coast of West Africa, and Hamilco, who may have reached Britain. They encouraged the spread of Punic culture and language, while remaining open to foreign ideas. The seeds of Carthage's greatness were sown in its Phoenician past, but the city's future would be shaped by the challenges it faced in Africa and beyond. The story of Carthage's rise is one of adaptation, of taking old traditions and reshaping them to fit a new world. This ability to change, while holding on to a sense of identity, would be both Carthage's greatest strength and, in time, a source of conflict. as Carthage looked outward, seeking new opportunities and confronting new threats. Its legacy as a Phoenician daughter would become the foundation for a civilization that would rival even the greatest powers of its age. How does a city move from success to supremacy? Carthage's transformation from a prosperous trading outpost into a Mediterranean heavyweight did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process shaped by opportunity, competition, and the natural drive of its people to protect and expand what they had built. By the 6th century BC, Carthage was no longer just a daughter of Tyre. It had become the heart of a growing network that stretched across the western Mediterranean, influencing cultures, economies, and politics wherever its ships made port. The first step in Carthage's rise was its mastery of trade. The city's location was key, at a crossroads between Africa, Europe, and the Near East. From here, Carthaginian merchants could reach the mineral-rich lands of Spain, the fertile fields of Sicily, and the bustling markets of Egypt. Carthaginian ships, fast and sturdy, became a common sight along these routes. They brought back not only silver and gold but also tin, lead, ivory, exotic animals, and even amber from as far away as the Baltic. Every arrival added to Carthage's wealth and reputation. But Carthage was more than just a city of traders. Its leaders understood that economic power required security. They invested heavily in their navy, building one of the largest and most advanced fleets of the ancient world. The city's twin harbors, with their carefully planned docks and ship sheds, became famous throughout the Mediterranean. In times of peace, the commercial harbor buzzed with activity, while the circular military harbor stood always ready for action. In times of war, hundreds of ships could launch at a moment's notice, projecting Carthaginian power wherever it was needed. The expansion of Carthaginian influence was not limited to the sea. The city also reached out to the land around it, forging alliances and sometimes clashing with the native Berber tribes. Over time, Carthage came to control a wide belt of territory along the North African coast. Here, large estates produced grain, olives, and fruit, feeding the growing population and providing surplus for export. Many of these estates were worked by local laborers or slaves, while the profits flowed back to the city's elite families. Carthage's reach extended even further to the islands and coasts of the western Mediterranean. In Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands, Carthaginian settlements sprang up, each acting as a link in a chain that spanned the sea. Some of these were simple trading posts, while others grew into substantial towns, complete with their own walls, temples, and marketplaces. In Spain, Carthaginian presence deepened, especially in the south, where rich mineral resources attracted both settlers and fortune seekers. This expansion brought Carthage into frequent contact and sometimes conflict with other powers. The Greeks, in particular, were both rivals and partners. Greek colonies dotted the coasts of Sicily and southern Italy, creating zones where competition for land, trade, and influence was fierce. Sometimes, Greeks and Carthaginians fought bitter wars. At other times, they traded goods and ideas, borrowing from each other in art, technology, and even religion. Inside Carthage, society reflected the city's diversity and complexity. At the top stood a wealthy elite of landowners and merchants. These families controlled much of the city's wealth and political power, serving on the Council of Elders and electing the Sophites who oversaw the city's day-to-day affairs. Below them were artisans, craftsmen, sailors, and laborers, men and women who kept the city running and the ships moving. Slavery was a fact of life as in most ancient societies, but slaves in Carthage could sometimes earn or buy their freedom and become part of the city as bustling community. Daily life in Carthage was shaped by the rhythms of trade, work, and worship. The city's streets were narrow and lively, filled with the sounds of markets, workshops, and children at play. Houses were built close together, often around courtyards that offered shade and a place for family gatherings. Public spaces included temples, markets, and public baths, where citizens could meet, exchange news, and take part in the rituals that marked the passing of the year. Carthaginian religion was both familiar and unique. The city's gods were inherited from the Phoenician homeland, but had taken on new forms and meanings in Africa. Baal Hamon and Tanit remained central, honored with festivals, offerings, and prayers for protection and prosperity. The Tophet, a sacred precinct outside the city walls, was a place of both reverence and controversy. Here, according to some ancient sources, children were sacrificed during times of great crisis, their lives offered to the gods in exchange for the city's survival. Archaeologists have found urns containing the ashes and bones of young children, confirming that some kind of ritual took place. Whether these were sacrifices, burials for children who died of natural causes, or a mixture of both is still debated, but the stories have added to the mystery and tragedy of Carthage's legacy. The Carthaginians were innovators as well as inheritors. In agriculture, they developed techniques for improving soil, conserving water, and increasing yields that would later be admired by Roman writers. In shipbuilding, they refined the trireme, a fast and maneuverable warship that became the backbone of their navy. Their commercial laws, contracts, and banking practices set standards that influenced others. Carthaginian craftsmen produced fine jewelry, pottery, glass, and textiles, some of which have been found as far away as Italy and Greece. Carthage was also a center of learning and exploration. Its sailors ventured into the Atlantic, reaching the shores of Morocco and possibly even beyond. The famous voyage of Hanno, recorded in an inscription, describes a journey down the west coast of Africa, founding colonies and trading with local peoples and encountering animals that some historians believe were gorillas. These journeys expanded Carthage's knowledge of the world and brought new resources and opportunities back to the city. Yet for all its achievements, Carthage could never escape the challenges that came with its power. The city's dependence on trade made it vulnerable to disruption, whether from pirates, rivals, or natural disasters. Its control over subject peoples, both in Africa and overseas, required constant negotiation and sometimes force. And its relationship with the Greeks remained a source of both opportunity and danger as alliances shifted and ambitions grew. As Carthage entered the 5th century BC, it stood as the undisputed leader of a vast network that connected peoples and cultures from Africa to Europe. Its ships ruled the waves, its markets set prices, and its influence could be felt in every major port. But the very forces that had built Carthage's success, competition, innovation, and the drive for security would soon push the city into new and more dangerous conflicts. For the next great test of Carthage's power would come not from the Greeks, but from another rising power across the sea, Rome. Carthage's emergence as a Mediterranean power was not the result of chance. It was built on the hard work, adaptability, and vision of its people. They combined the skills of their Phoenician ancestors with the lessons learned from their African neighbors and the demands of a changing world. They created a city that was both a marketplace and a fortress, a home for the restless and the ambitious. And for centuries, they succeeded in making Carthage not just a place on a map, but a force that shaped the destiny of nations. But every empire has its limits. The next phase of Carthage's story would test everything its people had built: their ships, their armies, their alliances, and their will to survive. The struggle for Sicily, the wars with the Greeks, and the coming shadow of Rome would push Carthage to its breaking point and force it to choose between adaptation and destruction. Why did Sicily become the battleground for two of the ancient world's most ambitious civilizations? To understand the rivalry between Carthage and the Greeks, you have to look at Sicily's geography. It sits right in the center of the Mediterranean, its fertile fields and bustling ports drawing the attention of every power in the region. For the Greeks, Sicily represented new land and opportunity. For Carthage, it was a vital link in their trade routes and a buffer against rival powers. Inevitably, their ambitions collided. The earliest Greek settlements in Sicily appeared in the 8th century BC, nearly at the same time as Carthage was taking root in North Africa. Greek colonists founded cities like Syracuse, Gela, and Selinus on the island's eastern and southern coasts. These new arrivals quickly turned Sicily into a patchwork of competing communities, some Greek, some native Sicel, and others connected to the expanding Carthaginian network. At first, there was trade and cautious coexistence. But as the island's wealth became clear, competition turned to conflict. Carthage's first significant involvement in Sicilian affairs began in the late 6th century BC. The Carthaginians had established outposts on the island's western tip at Matia, Panermus, and Salentum. These sites were both trading centers and military footholds, intended to secure Carthage's interests against both Greek rivals and local resistance. The Greeks, meanwhile, were pushing west, their cities growing richer and more powerful, sometimes at the expense of the indigenous peoples. Tensions boiled over in the late 500s and early 400s BC. The spark came when Greek tyrants, eager to expand their influence, attacked Carthaginian allies in western Sicily. Carthage responded with force, launching expeditions across the narrow sea. The resulting wars were long and brutal, marked by sieges, shifting alliances, and moments of both triumph and disaster for each side. Carthaginian armies, made up of mercenaries from Africa, Spain, and Italy, faced off against Greek hoplites in battles that sometimes left entire cities destroyed. One of the most dramatic episodes came in 480 BC, when the Carthaginians, led by the general Hamilcar, launched a massive invasion of Sicily in support of an ally under threat from the Greeks of Syracuse. The timing was no accident. The Greeks were also fighting the Persians under Xerxes in the east, and Carthage may have seen an opportunity to shift the balance of power. The campaign ended in disaster for Carthage. After initial successes, their army was struck by plague during the siege of Himra, and Hamilcar was killed. The Carthaginians retreated, and for decades after, they were cautious in their dealings with the Greeks. But the struggle for Sicily was far from over. The island was simply too important. Carthage rebuilt its forces, strengthened its footholds, and learned from its defeats. Over the following centuries, a cycle of war, peace, and renewed conflict defined Carthaginian-Greek relations in the West. Each side sought to outmaneuver the other using diplomacy, military power, and alliances with local peoples to gain the upper hand. At times, Carthaginian and Greek cities even cooperated, trading goods and sharing technology. At other times, they fought bitterly over every inch of land. By the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC, Carthage had regained much of its strength in Sicily. Under generals like Hannibal Mago and Himilco, Carthaginian armies once again challenged the Greek cities, capturing and destroying several key strongholds. The Greeks responded with their own champions. Dionysius of Syracuse, a ruthless and ambitious leader, built massive walls around his city and constructed a huge fleet to take the fight to Carthage. The wars raged back and forth, with sieges that lasted for years and battles that devastated the countryside. The struggle for Sicily was not just a contest of arms, but also of ideas and methods. Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries, hiring professional soldiers from across its empire and beyond. This gave its commanders flexibility and numbers, but sometimes led to divided loyalty and discipline problems. The Greeks, in contrast, fielded citizen armies that fought to defend their own cities and traditions. Both sides built impressive fortifications and siege engines, testing the limits of ancient military technology. Despite their rivalry, the Greeks and Carthaginians influenced each other in many ways. Greek pottery, art, and even religious ideas found their way into Carthaginian homes. In turn, Carthaginian trade and diplomatic practices shaped how the Greeks dealt with their neighbors. On the battlefield, both sides adapted tactics and equipment to face their opponents. Over time, the lines between Greek and Carthaginian Sicily blurred, creating a unique hybrid culture in some regions. The wars for Sicily had major consequences for Carthage. Success brought new territory and wealth, but also new challenges. Governing distant lands was never easy, especially when local populations resented foreign rule. Carthage had to balance military power with diplomacy, offering incentives to some communities while punishing others. At times, revolts broke out, forcing Carthage to send more troops and resources than it could easily spare. The constant pressure of war also shaped Carthage's institutions and society. The need to fund large armies and fleets led to new taxes and financial innovations. The city's ruling elite became ever more focused on military and political affairs, sometimes at the expense of the broader population. At the same time, the wars fostered a spirit of resilience and adaptability. Carthaginian generals learned to use local geography to their advantage, and their engineers became experts in building and breaking fortifications. By the end of the 4th century BC, Carthage was established as the dominant power in western Sicily, though the Greeks continued to resist. The cost of constant conflict was high, but for Carthage, control of Sicily was not optional. The island's grain fed their people. Its ports secured their trade. Its position blocked rivals from threatening the heart of the Carthaginian world. Yet, even as Carthage consolidated its hold over Sicily, new challenges were emerging. The Greeks in Sicily were weakened but not defeated, and other Greek powers, particularly in the east, continued to watch the west with interest. More importantly, a new power was rising in Italy. Rome, a city that had once been little more than a local player, was rapidly growing in strength and ambition. For decades, Carthage and Rome had little direct contact, but that was about to change. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remake the Mediterranean world. The wars for Sicily had taught Carthage hard lessons in both victory and defeat. The city had shown that it could adapt, rebuild, and innovate under pressure. It had proven its ability to project power far from home and to manage a vast and diverse network of allies and subjects. But the price was constant vigilance and the risk of overreach. The next great challenge Carthage faced would come not from across the narrow straits of Sicily, but from across the Tyrrhenian Sea, where Rome watched, learned, and waited for its moment. And so, As the dust settled over the battlefields of Sicily, Carthage stood at a crossroads. Its power was secure, but its future was uncertain. The island that had been the prize in a centuries-long struggle was now the flashpoint for an even greater conflict, one that would decide not just the fate of Carthage or Sicily, but the destiny of the entire Mediterranean. What happens when two rising powers meet on a collision course? For centuries, Carthage and Rome grew in parallel, each building its strength on opposite sides of the Mediterranean. Their early interactions were cautious, even cooperative. Both were republics, both valued order and prosperity, and both recognized the dangers of unchecked expansion. But their ambitions, once safely separated by distance and distinct interests, gradually began to overlap. The first sparks of conflict flared not because either side sought total war, but because the patchwork of alliances, rivalries, and opportunities in the central Mediterranean pulled them together and then pitted them against each other. Rome's rise was as remarkable as Carthage's. From humble beginnings as a collection of villages on the Tiber River, Rome unified its neighbors through conquest and alliance, extending its influence across the Italian peninsula. Roman society was proud and disciplined, with a political system that rewarded ambition and military success. As Rome's armies subdued Etruscans, Samnites, and Greeks in southern Italy, its gaze inevitably shifted outward. Beyond the Straits of Messina lay Sicily, a land rich in grain and strategically vital for controlling the sea lanes between east and west. Carthage, meanwhile, had invested decades in securing its interests in Sicily and the western Mediterranean. It was a city accustomed to managing far-flung outposts and negotiating with powerful neighbors. For a long time, Carthage and Rome coexisted with mutual respect, even signing treaties that defined their respective zones of influence and ensured the safety of each other as merchants. But as both powers expanded, Sicily became a place where their ambitions overlapped. The island, so often fought over by Greeks and Carthaginians, now became the trigger for a new and even greater struggle. The First Punic War broke out in 264 BC, over what might seem a minor dispute, the fate of the city of Messana at the northeastern tip of Sicily. A band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines took control of Messana and soon found themselves threatened by local powers. The Mamertines appealed first to Carthage, which sent a garrison, and then to Rome, which saw an opportunity to intervene in Sicilian affairs. Rome's decision to send troops across the strait marked the point of no return. Carthage, unwilling to surrender its foothold, responded in kind. What neither side expected was the scale and duration of the conflict that followed. The First Punic War became the longest and most expensive war either republic had ever fought. For over 20 years, Carthaginian and Roman armies and navies clashed over Sicily, Sardinia, and the surrounding seas. Carthage, with its superior fleet and experience in naval warfare, initially had the upper hand at sea. Roman soldiers, meanwhile, proved formidable on land and soon adapted to fighting in unfamiliar territory. One of Rome's great strengths was its capacity to learn and innovate. Realizing it could not match Carthage's seamanship, Rome built its own fleet from scratch, copying captured Carthaginian ships and introducing the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into infantry contests, an area where Romans excelled. These innovations allowed Rome to win several key victories at sea, most notably at Mylae and Egnomus, even as both sides suffered devastating losses from storms and shipwrecks. The war dragged on, sapping the resources and patience of both cities. Sicily became a graveyard for armies, with long sieges, shifting alliances, and brutal reprisals. Carthage depended heavily on mercenary forces from Africa, Spain, and Gaul, while Rome drew on the manpower of its Italian allies. The balance of power shifted back and forth, but slowly the tide turned in Rome's favor. The final blow came in 241 BC at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. There, the Roman fleet destroyed the last Carthaginian ships sent to relieve their besieged forces in Sicily. Exhausted and bankrupt, Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh for Carthage. The city was forced to abandon Sicily entirely, pay a massive indemnity, and accept limits on its ability to wage war in the region. Sicily became Rome's first province outside the Italian peninsula, a critical step in Rome's transformation from an Italian power to a Mediterranean empire. The loss stung Carthage deeply. Its treasury was nearly empty, its army demoralized, and its prestige damaged. Worse still, the aftermath of war led to a dangerous revolt by Carthage's own mercenaries, who, unpaid and angry, threatened the city itself. Carthage barely survived the crisis, but it emerged weaker and wary of future conflict with Rome. Yet Carthage was not finished. Stripped of its holdings in Sicily, it turned its ambitions westward to Spain, where new opportunities beckoned. There, under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca and his family, Carthage began to carve out a new empire, rich in silver and manpower. The Barcids, as Hamilcar's clan became known, rebuilt Carthaginian fortunes through a mixture of force and diplomacy. The founding of New Carthage, Cartagena, on the Spanish coast, symbolized this new direction. It was a city designed to rival the splendor and power of its namesake, a symbol of hope after years of defeat. All the while, Rome and Carthage watched each other with growing suspicion. Treaties defined boundaries, but neither side trusted the other. The Romans, wary of Carthage's recovery, kept a close eye on events in Spain. The Carthaginians, nursing old wounds, sought ways to restore their position and independence. The peace between them was uneasy more a pause than an end to rivalry. Beneath the surface, the seeds of the next and even more devastating conflict were already growing. Carthage, with its new wealth and leadership, would soon find itself led by one of the most extraordinary commanders in history, Hannibal Barca. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage, already fierce, would become a struggle for survival, a war not just of armies and navies, but of wills and ideas. Thus, the story of Carthage and Rome entered a new and fateful chapter. What had started as a dispute over a Sicilian city became the opening act of a series of wars that would decide who ruled the Mediterranean. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences would echo far beyond the walls of either city. How does a city recover from defeat and humiliation, and how do new leaders emerge from the rubble of lost wars? For Carthage, the aftermath of the First Punic War was a time of reckoning. The city had lost not only Sicily, its richest overseas possession, but also its sense of security. The massive indemnity owed to Rome strained every facet of the city's economy. Even as the dust settled, another crisis erupted: the mercenary war. Thousands of unpaid soldiers, Libyans, Numidians, Gauls, and Iberians who had fought for Carthage in Sicily returned home demanding their due. When Carthage faltered in payments, these battle-hardened men rebelled, laying siege to the very city they had once served. This was a war more savage and desperate than any Carthage had faced, pitting the city's survival against the chaos it had unleashed. The crisis might have destroyed Carthage entirely, But from this trial by fire, new leaders rose. Chief among them was Hamilcar Barca, a general whose drive and toughness would shape Carthaginian destiny for decades. Hamilcar, with a blend of cunning and ruthlessness, broke the siege and defeated the mercenaries, restoring order to Carthage and its territories. Yet the city's wounds ran deep. The loss of Sicily and the cost of indemnity to Rome left Carthage desperate for new sources of wealth and power. Hamilcar looked west to Spain, a land rich in silver, copper, and fertile fields. For Carthage, Spain represented both an escape from Roman oversight and a chance to rebuild its fortune. With the city's blessing, Hamilcar led an army across the sea, launching a campaign that would reshape Iberia's political map. His approach mixed force with negotiation. He fought local tribes when needed, but also forged alliances and integrated Iberian warriors into his growing army. In the south, he founded the city of Carthage, New Carthage, known today as Cartagena, a strategic base for Carthaginian expansion. The Barcid family soon became synonymous with Carthaginian power in Spain. After Hamilcar's death, reportedly in battle against native tribes, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair took command. Hasdrubal continued the work of consolidation, building cities, negotiating with tribal leaders, and strengthening Carthage's hold on the region. He also entered into a treaty with Rome, agreeing not to cross the river Ebro in northern Spain, a deal that would later prove fateful. But the most important figure to emerge from this period was Hamilcar's son, Hannibal Barca. From an early age, Hannibal was marked for greatness. Legend holds that, before leaving for Spain, Hamilcar made his young son swear eternal hatred for Rome. Whether or not this oath was real, it reflected the mood of a generation. Hannibal grew up in military camps, learning tactics, logistics, and the art of war from his father and Carthage's best commanders. He saw firsthand the value of boldness, the necessity of adapting to new conditions, and the importance of understanding one's enemies. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, command passed to Hannibal, still in his 20s, but already proven as a soldier and leader. Hannibal wasted little time in acting on his ambitions. He campaigned deep into the Iberian interior, bringing new tribes under Carthaginian control. The army he built was a multi-ethnic force: Carthaginians, Iberians, Celts, and African cavalry, all bound by loyalty to their charismatic commander and the promise of victory and plunder. It was in Spain that Hannibal began to prepare for what he saw as the inevitable confrontation with Rome. The peace imposed after the First Punic War had never truly settled the rivalry. It had only postponed it. Tensions simmered as both sides eyed each other warily. Rome watched Carthage's expansion in Spain with suspicion. The treaty at the Ebro was supposed to limit Carthaginian movement, but both sides tested its boundaries. Hannibal's real test came when he attacked the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally south of the Ebro. The siege and eventual fall of Saguntum gave Rome the excuse it needed. War was declared, and the Second Punic War, the most famous and destructive of all the Punic conflicts, began. This was the war that would make Hannibal a legend. But it was also the result of decades of Carthaginian resilience and strategic adaptation. The city had survived defeat, internal rebellion, and economic hardship. Under the Barcids, it had rebuilt its wealth and power not by seeking revenge for its own sake, but by securing new resources and allies. Spain became the engine that fueled Carthage's recovery. Its mines paid the indemnity to Rome. Its warriors filled the ranks of Carthaginian armies, and its ports opened new routes for trade. The Barcids also changed the nature of Carthaginian politics. In earlier times, Carthage had been ruled by a broad elite, a council of elders drawn from many leading families. Under Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, and Hannibal, the Barcid family became almost a dynasty, concentrating military and political authority in their own hands. This shift brought new energy and focus, but also created tensions at home. Some in Carthage, as traditional elite, resented the Barcids' power and worried about the risks of Hannibal's bold plans. They feared that another war with Rome, especially one fought far from home, could bring disaster. Yet it was Hannibal's vision, determination, and skill that would define Carthage's fate in the coming years. He was a commander who understood that Rome could not be defeated through attrition alone. Only a direct attack could break Roman power. The stage was set for one of the greatest military campaigns in history. The story of Carthage in this era is not just about one man or one family, however. It is about a city's ability to survive adversity by changing course. After the First Punic War, Carthage might have faded into obscurity, content to cling to what it had left. Instead, it looked outward, took risks, and rebuilt its fortunes. The Barcids' gamble in Spain was bold, but it was also rooted in necessity. With Rome dominant in Sicily and the central Mediterranean, Carthage needed a new base of power to survive and compete. As Hannibal assembled his forces in Spain, the world watched. Rome prepared for war, confident in its own strength, but wary of its old enemy's cunning. Carthage, for all its divisions, rallied behind its most brilliant son. The Second Punic War would test both cities to their limits and leave a mark on history that endures to this day. What does it take for a single commander to change the course of history? Hannibal Barca, the son of Hamilcar, would answer that question not with words, but with actions that would stun the ancient world and echo through centuries of military history. The Second Punic War, launched by Hannibal's daring attack on Rome's ally Saguntum, quickly became a test not just of armies, but of will, strategy, and endurance. Hannibal's strategy was as audacious as it was risky. Instead of waiting for the Romans to bring the war to Spain or North Africa, he would carry the fight directly to Rome. His plan was to cross the Alps, the immense, snow-covered mountain range that separated Italy from the rest of Europe, with a mixed army of Carthaginians, Iberians, Celts, and North Africans. This was an unprecedented feat. No one expected an enemy to appear in Italy from that direction, and Roman defenses were focused elsewhere. The march began in 218 BC. Hannibal's army was made up of tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and even a handful of elephants. The journey was grueling. Soldiers faced treacherous mountain paths, early winter snows, rockfalls, and hostile tribes. Many men and animals perished. Yet Hannibal's leadership and the hope of victory and reward drove his forces onward. When Hannibal finally descended into the plains of northern Italy, his army was battered but still formidable. The Romans, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. What followed was a series of battles that would become legendary for their brilliance and brutality. At the river Trebia, Hannibal lured a larger Roman army into a trap, using the element of surprise and the icy river to his advantage. The Roman defeat sent shockwaves through the Republic. The next year, near Lake Trasimene, Hannibal again demonstrated his mastery of ambush tactics. He concealed his troops in the hills and attacked as a Roman column advanced along the lakeshore, driving thousands into the water or to their deaths. In less than 2 years, Hannibal had destroyed two major Roman armies on Italian soil. Rome was shaken, but not broken. The Senate refused to negotiate, even as fears swept the countryside. Instead, they appointed a new commander, Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose cautious tactics, later called the Fabian strategy, focused on avoiding direct battles, harassing Hannibal's supply lines and wearing down his army through attrition. Hannibal, meanwhile, sought to break Rome's alliances by marching through Italy, offering freedom to cities willing to join him. Some defected, but most remained loyal to Rome, fearing Roman revenge if Hannibal's campaign failed. The single most famous clash came in 216 BC at Cannae in southern Italy. Here, Hannibal faced a massive Roman force, perhaps the largest Rome had ever assembled. With fewer men, Hannibal arranged his troops in a subtle crescent formation, deliberately placing his weakest units in the center. As the Romans pressed forward, the Carthaginian center gradually fell back, drawing the Romans inward. At the critical moment, Hannibal's African infantry wheeled around the flanks while his cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, attacked from behind. The Romans were surrounded and slaughtered. Cannae became a byword for annihilation, studied by generals for centuries as the ultimate double envelopment. The aftermath of Cannae was Rome's darkest hour. Allies wavered, and some southern cities went over to Hannibal, yet Rome chose resolve over surrender. The Senate raised fresh armies, fortified the city, and refused to negotiate terms. Over the next years, the war became a grim contest of endurance. Hannibal remained undefeated in battle, but he could not force Rome's allies to abandon the Republic in large numbers. Supplies and reinforcements from Carthage were limited by Roman control of the seas. The war ground on, with Hannibal winning skirmishes, but unable to take Rome itself. Meanwhile, the conflict spread far beyond Italy. In Spain, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal fought to hold back Roman advances, but Rome gradually gained ground. In Sicily, Rome wrested control from pro-Carthaginian forces. The balance began to shift as young Roman commanders, notably Publius Cornelius Scipio, rose to prominence. Scipio adopted some of Hannibal's own tactics and brought a new energy to Rome's war effort. After more than a decade in Italy, Hannibal's situation became increasingly precarious. Rome's armies pressed south in Spain, cutting off Carthaginian resources. In North Africa, the allied king Massinissa brought the powerful Numidian cavalry over to Rome's side, tilting the balance further. Finally, Scipio took the war to Carthage itself, landing an army in Africa and threatening the city. The Carthaginian government, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. The final confrontation came at Zama, southwest of Carthage. In 202 BC, the two greatest commanders of their age faced each other for the first and only time. Hannibal's army, exhausted and outnumbered, included many raw recruits and only a handful of veterans from Italy. Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods and adapted his own tactics, using the superior Numidian cavalry to devastating effect. The Carthaginian war elephants, meant to break the Roman lines, were neutralized or routed. In the end, Hannibal's forces collapsed under the combined weight of Roman discipline and Numidian mobility. The defeat at Zama ended the Second Punic War. Carthage was forced to accept harsh terms, a huge indemnity, loss of all overseas possessions except parts of North Africa, and a ban on waging war without Rome's permission. Hannibal, though admired even by his enemies, was eventually driven into exile. He spent his final years moving from court to court, always hunted by Rome, always seeking ways to oppose them until his death. Hannibal's genius had come close to breaking Rome, but in the end, Rome's resilience, resources, and ability to adapt proved decisive. The Second Punic War left Carthage humbled but not destroyed. The city rebuilt, focused on trade and recovery, but it would never again challenge Rome as an equal on the battlefield. Yet Hannibal's legacy endured. His campaigns became legends, studied by generals from Julius Caesar to Napoleon to modern times. He showed what boldness and innovation could accomplish, even against overwhelming odds. And his shadow continued to haunt Rome, shaping its policies and fueling the fears that would one day lead to Carthage's final destruction. What does a society do after it has lost everything it once dreamed of? Carthage, after the defeat at Zama, faced a world utterly changed. The city was no longer the master of Sicily, Spain, or the Western Mediterranean. Its navy was gone, its armies dismantled, its spirit wounded. The peace imposed by Rome after the Second Punic War was harsh and humiliating. Carthage was forced to pay a crushing indemnity, deliver hostages, and ask Rome's permission before waging even the smallest war, even for self-defense. For a generation, the city's energies turned inward, focused on survival and recovery in the shadow of Rome's rising empire. Yet Carthage was not finished. The city that had survived so many disasters before now showed a different kind of resilience. With the threat of war removed and the burden of empire gone, Carthage's people adapted. They turned their attention to the land and the sea, rebuilding what was lost, but this time with caution and ingenuity. The city's old merchant elite revived agriculture with a new focus, investing in olive groves, vineyards, and grain fields that turned the African plain into a patchwork of productivity. Carthaginian farmers became famous for their advanced techniques, efficient irrigation, crop rotation, and the use of fertilizers. Roman writers, including the famed Cato, would later admire and even copy Carthaginian agricultural methods. Trade, too, found new life. Carthage's position on the African coast was still ideal for commerce. Without the cost of armies and fleets, the city's merchants quietly grew rich again, trading with Egypt, Numidia, and even Rome itself. Carthaginian textiles, pottery, and agricultural goods became prized in markets near and far. The city's workshops buzzed with activity, its streets filled with the sounds of commerce, debate, and daily life. Carthaginian society also changed. The power of the Barcid family faded after Hannibal's exile and death, and the old council of elders resumed leadership. Politics became more cautious, focused on stability and avoiding any action that might give Rome a pretext for intervention. A new generation grew up knowing only peace, but also the constant presence of Roman oversight. The city's laws and traditions were maintained, but there was always a sense of being watched, of limits never far from view. But peace did not mean safety. Carthage's neighbors, especially the Numidian kingdom led by Massinissa, took advantage of Carthage's weakness. Massinissa, once an ally of Rome against Hannibal, was now a powerful king, eager to expand his territory at Carthage's expense. He launched raids on Carthaginian farms and settlements, seizing land and harassing villagers. Carthage, forbidden by treaty from waging war, could do little to resist. Appeals to Rome fell on deaf ears. The Romans saw Massinissa as a useful ally and enjoyed watching Carthage humbled. Inside Rome, Carthage's revival, even as a peaceful trading city, became a source of anxiety for some leaders. The city's old reputation as a rival, combined with its economic recovery, led to growing suspicion. No Ramang was more persistent in this than Cato the Elder, a stern statesman who ended every speech, regardless of the topic, with the words "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. For Cato and others, the very existence of Carthage was an intolerable risk, a reminder of the terror Hannibal once brought to Italy. In Carthage, debates raged about how to respond. Some urged patience, hoping to appease Rome and weather the storm. Others argued for a more assertive policy, insisting that Carthage could not allow itself to be baited and bullied forever. The city's leaders were caught between two dangers. Acting could provoke Rome, but doing nothing meant slow strangulation by Numidian aggression. The crisis came to a head when, after years of Numidian attacks, Carthage finally fought back without Roman approval. The city's leaders decided they could no longer allow Massinissa to seize their land with impunity. They raised an army and engaged the Numidian king in battle. It was a desperate gamble, and it failed. Massiniss's troops, better equipped and supported by Rome, defeated the Carthaginians. Worse, Carthage's violation of the treaty gave Rome the excuse it needed to intervene. In Rome, voices like Cato's found their moment. The Senate declared that Carthage had broken its word and must be punished once and for all. What followed was a gathering of Roman armies, a resolution for total war, and the beginning of the end for a city that had once rivaled Rome for mastery of the world. Yet in these final years, Carthage remained proud. Its people remembered their history, their achievements, and their losses. They knew what was coming, but they did not surrender easily. The resilience shown after Zama, the ability to rebuild and adapt in the face of Rome's dominance, was a testament to the spirit of a city that would rather risk destruction than accept a slow and silent death. The final struggle, the Third Punic War, was about to begin. Carthage was no longer an empire, but its fate would still shape the destiny of the Mediterranean. The city's last stand would be both a tragedy and an echo of its greatest days, a reminder that even in defeat, a civilization's character can endure. What does it look like when an entire civilization is threatened with complete erasure? The years leading up to the Third Punic War were marked by anxiety, frustration, and a slow tightening of the noose around Carthage. The city that had once ruled the Western Mediterranean was now hemmed in by the true ambitions of its neighbors and the relentless suspicion of Rome. Skirmishes along the frontier with Numidia, led by King Massinissa, became a routine humiliation. Carthage's appeals to Rome for justice were ignored. Instead, Roman commissioners looked on as Carthaginian lands were taken, their citizens harassed, and their pride wounded again and again. When Carthage finally acted in self-defense, it played directly into Roman hands. The Senate in Rome, led by the persistent warnings of Cato the Elder and others, seized on this as the excuse they had long sought. Rome declared war, and a massive army assembled for the final reckoning. The message was clear: Carthage must not merely submit, it must cease to exist. The Romans landed in Africa in 149 BC, demanding impossible terms as a prelude to attack. They ordered Carthage to surrender all weapons and arms, to hand over hundreds of hostages, and then, in a final crushing, the demand to abandon the city itself and move 10 miles inland, leaving the proud metropolis on the coast to be destroyed. For the people of Carthage, this was not negotiation but a sentence of death. Refusing to leave their ancestral home, they prepared for a last desperate defense. The city's walls, recently strengthened, became the front line. Inside, The population, men, women, old and young alike, labored night and day to resist the siege. They melted down household metal to forge new weapons. They turned every street and building into a barricade. Carthaginian women cut their hair to make bowstrings, and children carried stones to the ramparts. Every able-bodied person became a defender. There was no illusion about what would happen if the Romans broke through. For nearly 3 years, Carthage held out. The Romans, led at first by less capable commanders, struggled to break the city's defenses. Disease, hunger, and the sheer tenacity of Carthage's resistance slowed the invaders. The city's harbors, critical for bringing in supplies, were blockaded, but Carthaginian engineers dug a secret canal, allowing their ships a final, desperate sortie against the Roman fleet. Even as hope faded, the defenders refused to surrender. In 147 BC, the Roman command passed to Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal 50 years earlier. Young, determined, and ruthless, Scipio reorganized the army, tightened the siege, and began a systematic assault on the city's walls. House by house, street by street, the Romans advanced. Fires raged through the neighborhoods as both sides fought with the knowledge that there would be no mercy. The final assault came in the spring of 146 BC. Roman soldiers stormed the Byrsa, the citadel at the heart of Carthage. The last defenders, exhausted and starving, made their stand among temples and shrines. According to ancient sources, the city's leaders led by Hasdrubal. The Carthaginian commander sought terms only when all hope was lost. Hasdrubal surrendered, but his wife, refusing to become a slave, threw herself and her children into the flames of the burning temple. The aftermath was a scene of utter devastation. The Romans killed or enslaved the surviving population, tens of thousands of men, women, and children. The city, so long a center of trade, culture, and power, was reduced to rubble. Temples, houses, and public buildings were torn down or set ablaze. The harbors were filled with debris, the land sown with salt, or so the legend claims, to ensure that nothing would ever grow again. Whether or not the salting truly happened, the intention was clear. Carthage was to be erased not just from the map, but from memory. The Roman victors celebrated their triumph with processions and monuments, boasting that their greatest rival had been destroyed. The territory around Carthage was reorganized as the Romang province of Africa, eventually to become a vital part of Rome's grain supply and a new center of Roman culture and settlement. But the old Carthage was gone. Its people were scattered, its language faded, its gods silenced. For centuries, the ruins of Carthage stood as a warning against defiance, a ghostly reminder of what happens to those who challenge empire and lose. Yet even in destruction, Carthage's story did not end. The memory of its resistance, the skill of its sailors and merchants, and the genius of leaders like Hannibal lived on in the annals of Roman historians, in the ruins that dotted the African shore, and in the lessons of history. The Third Punic War was not just the end of a city, but the end of an era. It marked the moment when Rome stood alone as master of the Western Mediterranean, but also when the costs of such mastery, ruthlessness, fear, and the loss of rivals became clear. The story of Carthage's final days is one of tragedy, courage, and, above all, a refusal to accept oblivion without a fight. As the smoke from the burning city drifted over the sea, the world changed. Carthage was gone, but its legacy, both as a warning and as an inspiration, would endure for generations. What remains of a civilization once it is erased from the map? The story of Carthage did not end with the flames and ruins of 146 BC in many ways. It was only just beginning to shape the world that followed. The destruction of Carthage marked the close of one chapter in Mediterranean history, but it also cast a long shadow over the centuries that came after. Rome would rule unchallenged, yet the memory of its greatest rival lingered in the minds of victors and vanquished alike. Immediately after the fall, the land where Carthage had stood was declared off-limits for new settlement. The Romans, proud of their victory, established the province of Africa, but they hesitated to build on Carthage's ashes. For a century, the site lay largely abandoned, its shattered walls and burned-out temples left as a warning to others. Travelers describe the silence among the ruins, the broken columns, and the toppled stones haunted by the memory of what once was. Some Roman writers, visiting the empty site, reflected on the cycles of fortune and the fate of even the greatest cities. Yet, even in defeat, Carthage's influence could not be so easily erased. Carthaginian ideas and innovations survived among the people of North Africa and beyond. The city's agricultural methods, careful irrigation, the use of crop rotation, and soil enrichment were studied and praised by Roman authors like Cato and Columella. Farmers across the Roman world adopted Carthaginian techniques, helping to sustain the empire's population for generations. In commerce, the structures and contracts used by Carthaginian merchants influenced Roman business practices, while Punic weights and measures remained in circulation long after the city itself was gone. Religion, too, left its traces. The worship of Baal Hammon in Tanit faded, but echoes of Punic religious customs can still be found in the archaeological record and in the rituals of some North African communities centuries later. Artistic styles, pottery designs, and architectural forms developed in Carthage continued to appear in the region's towns and villages. Even the Punic language survived among rural populations for centuries, gradually blending with Latin and Berber tongues. The memory of Hannibal and the Carthaginian struggle became part of Roman identity. Roman historians, from Polybius and Livy to Appian, wrote at length about the Punic Wars. They admired Hannibal's genius and used his campaigns as lessons in both the dangers of rivalry and the value of resilience. The phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became a proverb, a cautionary tale about the risks of unchecked enmity. Over time, the story was retold in epic poems, plays, and later, in the works of European writers who saw in Carthage as fall a warning about the fate of all empires. Centuries later, Carthage would be reborn not as the proud Punic city, but as a Roman colony. In the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar and later Augustus established a new Carthage on the old site, recognizing its strategic and economic value. This Roman Carthage grew rapidly, becoming one of the most important cities in Africa, second only to Alexandria. It boasted grand forums, theaters, baths, and a thriving Christian community that would play a key role in the early church. The new city was Roman in language and culture, but traces of the Punic past lingered in its layout, its people, and its spirit. Archaeology has gradually brought more of ancient Carthage to light. Excavations have revealed the outlines of harbors, the remnants of temples, and the sacred precincts of the Tophet. Buried beneath later Roman layers, scholars have found mosaics, inscriptions, and everyday objects that speak to the city's rich and complex life. These discoveries challenge old stereotypes and show Carthage not just as a rival to Rome, but as a center of creativity, trade, and cultural exchange. The legacy of Carthage is also a lesson in the dangers of rivalry and total war. Rome's destruction of the city was driven by fear and the desire for absolute security. Yet, by erasing its rivals so completely, Rome lost a source of challenge and innovation. Later generations would look back and wonder what more could have come from a world where Carthage had survived, where competition had bred not just conflict but mutual progress. Today, the ruins of Carthage are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors from around the world walk among its stones, looking out over the blue waters that once carried Carthaginian ships to every corner of the Mediterranean. The city's story continues to inspire historians, writers, and anyone who wonders about the rise and fall of great powers. Carthage's fate is a reminder that civilizations are not just measured by their victories or defeats, but by what they leave behind: ideas, skills, memories, and warnings. The story of Carthage, from its founding by Phoenician settlers to its final destruction and beyond, is not simply a tale of loss. It is also a testament to endurance, adaptation, and the enduring human longing for connection across time and space. Even erased, Carthage's voice still echoes, carrying lessons for all who listen. What can we learn from the vanished city by the sea? Today, as the sun sets over the coast of Tunisia, the ruins of Carthage glow softly against the evening sky. Grass grows where once there were bustling streets. The outlines of ancient harbors and the worn stones of temples survive as silent witnesses to a civilization's long journey from hopeful settlement to imperial power, from bitter rivalry to tragic oblivion. Yet, in this silence, there is a story that still asks to be heard. Carthage's history is not just a cycle of rise and fall. It is the story of people who built bridges across seas and cultures, who adapted and thrived in a world shaped by uncertainty. For centuries, Carthaginians balanced the traditions of their Phoenician ancestors with the realities of Africa and the Vanfrica and the demands of their vast Mediterranean network. They were merchants and farmers, sailors and generals, men and women who found both opportunity and danger at the heart of their world. The city's greatest achievements were rooted in this spirit of adaptation. Carthaginian farmers coaxed abundance from the North African soil, using techniques that would long outlast their empire. Their shipbuilders and sailors charted courses that widened the known world and connected distant peoples. Even their conflicts, painful as they were, spurred innovations in organization, engineering, and diplomacy. The Carthaginian council's debates and the city's resilience in the face of adversity became models for later generations, even for their conquerors. Yet Carthage's story is also a cautionary tale. Its rivalry with Rome ended not in compromise, but in catastrophe. Fear, pride, and distrust on both sides made peace impossible and war inevitable. When the end came, it came with a finality so complete that for centuries, Carthage was remembered less for what it had created than for how it had been destroyed. The ruins became a warning. Even the mightiest cities can be swept away by the tides of history. But history does not truly end. Carthage's legacy persisted in the fields and harbors of Africa, in the writings of Ramang and later scholars, and in the imagination of those who wondered about its lost wonders. The city's story has been retold in countless forms, as epic as tragedy, as lesson. Archaeologists continue to uncover layers of the past, piecing together the lives of those who once called Carthage home. Standing among its ruins today, it is possible to feel both the weight of loss and the persistence of memory. Carthage is gone, but it is not forgotten. Its echoes can be heard in the languages, the customs, and the dreams of the Mediterranean. Its fall reminds us of the costs of rivalry and the fragility of achievement. Yet its endurance through change, hardship, and even annihilation reminds us of something more hopeful, that the traces of human creativity and resilience can outlast even the most devastating defeats. As the light fades and the sea grows quiet, Carthage's story continues. It invites us to reflect, to remember, and to learn. In the silence of the stones and the stories carried on the wind, Carthage endures as a warning, a wonder, and a testament to the enduring complexity of the human story.